Okay, this will do. Forgive me, first of all, if I talk fast, but there's a lot to get through. Forgive me if you've heard any of this material before. I'm working through it in different ways. I don't have a new notation to propose. I'm really going to talk about a framework within which we might consider aspects of notation. My head is still reeling after dealing with too many notational proposals from other people, trying to find solutions for myself. So, I'm working on the framework at the moment. Come to specifics in individual cases, I'm sure. What I want to propose is that we generate some kind of more mobile, plastic relationship with notation by thinking of it as a technology, that we are aware when we are making the assumption that notation is a graphical problem. That is, in the broadest sense, if you think of notation as a technology, it's on a continuum, conventional understandings of technology on a continuum from, I don't know what, an instruction manual for your instrument, your fingering chart for your clarinet or whatever is part of the notational continuum through to, I don't know, a 360 video sound recording of the performance, whatever. So I want to suggest that we consider notation as a technology along with the other material and conceptual technologies that belong with it. That's kind of a map of what I'm going to talk about, but you'll find out in a minute what that is. What do I mean by hegemonic notation? Hegemony in the sense that it's very difficult for us culturally to think of notation except in conventional music notation terms. That is, we bring that baggage with us, and we need to be aware of that when we're considering notational issues. That is, conventional notation has this extraordinary power, and this is the nature of hegemony, that it's very powerful and makes it very difficult to resist. In the conventional situation, we can inscribe, instruct, represent, manipulate, analyze, all in the same language, if you like, in the same terms. This is an extraordinary cultural situation. But to think of that as being inevitably characteristic of music is as logical as thinking of the pyramids, wonderful as they are, of being inevitably characteristic of human architecture. So I'd like to think of it more as, if you like, a language. It's a language among other language games. Rotman, when he talks about mathematics, talks about the voices, the imperative, the indicative, and suggests that sometimes it functions as its own proof. And I think that's one of the situations we've kind of arrived at in terms of conventional music notation. Jeff Cox's book on code, he talks about the poetic affordances of code, that you can't separate code itself. This sort of apparent precision, objectivity of code is actually a cultural illusion that we project upon it. I mean, this goes back to Phil Eger's critical technical practice. It's not an objective, precise thing. It's a situated, embodied, material, sequential, narrative, constraint-driven situation. And precisely the fact you're dealing with multiple language games opens up this poetic property and generates the possibility of plasticity in notation. Stephen Davis' famous distinction between thick and thin notations, for instance, I think he uses, I can't remember what, Mozart Piano Concerto and the Stravinsky Ballet as examples. I don't think it's particularly helpful in itself, but it does illustrate the range of spaces of mobility that notation opens up for us. And in that respect, in thinking about new notations, our question is, well, which of these properties do we want in a particular notational context? Probably we can't have them all, and probably having them all would not be useful. That was a very particular cultural situation. The context for the use of notation, I have to disagree a little with Thor here, does change continuously. That is, what a pianist understands by notation of the most conventional music now is not necessarily what a pianist would have understood at the end of the 18th century. But the note itself, let's think of that as a sort of abstract example, because that's what people end up talking about in terms of Western common notation. One of its properties is that it gains a certain autonomy. It has a life of its own. But in looking at it that way, what we see is that it has porous borders with other technologies. I was talking about instruction manuals for instruments, for example, but what about the technologies of production, of dissemination, of travel of musicians, all these sorts of things. What I'd like to propose is that we think of technology, science, cosmology, if you like. They're the world of possible events, the world of possible operations. 5 minutes. So we think of these things as soft technologies. Notation is a soft technology like computer code itself. Technologies generate the conceptual models by which we might understand them. They therefore have materiality as well. They offer us particular modes of manipulation, and they're used in certain contexts. And I won't go through any of the examples, but you can think of how as manipulation. You can think of Beethoven folding paper. You can think of the way people annotate scores. How might we think of these? Well, in terms of measurement or control. And Aristophanes already in the 4th century said, well, if you're just measuring what people do or what it actually sounds like, you haven't got it. Okay, other modes of measurement. Stern's suggestion that in formatting representations of music, now he's talking about MP3 in particular, but it applies to notation in general, especially as we're dealing with the redistribution of determination into the real time, if you like, into the present. He contrasts the notion of spontaneity, what he calls the dream of spontaneity, with the dream of precision. And I think a question is, for us, is to what degree we can resist this orthogonal relationship. Now, what I'd like to propose is that in thinking of notation as a technology, among others, among the many technologies that go to determining the actual, if you like, the musical surface, the musical fact in a particular place, in a particular instant, what we can do is redraw our understanding of how music is determined. We can agree that at the moment it happens, it is determined. It's the question of how this determination takes place. As technological contexts change, what happens is that the space of possible maps of determination change. So, with technologies that allow us to determine some of these elements in the present, in the current situation, we bring some of that determination into the present, related to other constraints, related to other parameters, if you like. We can look at a map of the determining of a Beethoven symphony, of a Josquin motet. Similarly, by understanding the technologies, the material means by which these things are determined, we can understand how the fact, the musical fact in a particular present comes about. And that gives us a sort of unitary space within which we can understand these different ways of generating music. It's been an obsession of mine for a long time, how to deal with the space between composition and improvisation, how to deal with the space between, if you like, conventional musical notation, notations for musicians, and programming, computer code. We can think of it as a format, as compression. We can think of it as transduction. That is, we have a notion of informationality, if you like, a sort of informal concept that's quite current, that it's not just a question of mapping one form of energy onto another, but we have an interim state, the informational state, that allows us to think of the work of the musical thing as an abstraction in a non-metaphysical way. And I think this changes our concept of the work, but also changes the relationship that we might construct with historical works. The notion of unsatisfiability, Lacan's lamella, that actually between notation and realization and conception, there's an inevitable unsatisfiability. I talked about the space, the mobility of notations before. This is, if you like, the source of energy that drives the exploration of that space. So, again, we come back to Stern's dream of precision. And in my final minute, I shall suggest that we go back to recent sort of software studies work, look at Kitchen and Dodge's book on code space, which I think is very useful. It extends Lefebvre's idea of the production of space and suggests that what code does in its use, in its action, in its situated action, its material action, actually produces a space in collaboration, if you like, with a particular subject and a particular context. And I think if we use that as a starting point for these maps of technologies that determine the particular present, that might give us a way of deciding what kind of notation might be appropriate for a particular context. Thank you very much.
Swap over Jonathan, please be on stage, and if there are any questions for gentlemen. I had this thing, you talk about notation as technologies, and now that there are digital instruments, digital technologies of musical expression have evolved quite a lot. Would you agree with the statement that maybe notation hasn't evolved with them? And if so, why is that?
Now, I think concepts of notation haven't evolved with them. And that's partly because of this, if you like, hegemonic view of notation that is always behind what we imagine we're doing on one hand. And partly because, again, there's another resistance to conceiving of this sort of, to conceiving of a technological space. I mean, it goes back to, Kittler. I only recently discovered that one of Kittler's early inspirations was a lecture by Ligeti. It's really interesting. And of course, his last work is these great tomes on music and mathematics rooted in Greek, classical Greek music theory. So even Kittler finds music to be a model of a technological explanation of how concepts are distributed through culture. I found that particularly interesting. But technology does not just mean, it certainly doesn't just mean stuff you plug in that needs electricity. It also doesn't mean stuff that gets made in factories or anything like that. Notations are technologies. The wax tablet on which Palestrina would look to the affordances of a particular point of imitation in order to apply his algorithmic space of algorithmic potential to see how a motet might pan out in the absence of notation, because he couldn't write scores. That's a technology. The paper production, the fact that Bach has no sketches, Beethoven could use paper as if it was like an infinite hard drive. Yeah, this idea might be handy in 20 years' time, who knows. Paper production becomes a vital technology. The innovation of mensual notation, of the Ars Nova, what's that, 1322, Philippe de Vitry, coincides precisely with the, what's it called? The ridge escapement, which allows clocks to actually measure time evenly. We no longer rely on water clocks. And they start being produced at exactly that time. So the clock in Salisbury and the clock in Chioggia, I think, are the first ones that we still have of those. It coincides absolutely precisely. So a technological innovation seeds a concept which becomes culturally very powerful. The measuring of time in that particular way. Nobody just didn't think of time like that before. So these things go all the way through cultural history, and they're absolutely not dependent on particular objects. Once it exists as a conceptual possibility culturally, then you don't need the object anymore. Notation massively conditions the way conventional musicians think about music, completely in the absence of a score or a piece of paper. So a technology is a potentially virtual thing, if you like, but grounded in informal concepts of what is materially possible. Sorry, it's a very long answer.